Tonight, we begin with something complex, if not slightly pungent. The medieval inn. This was not a charming bed and breakfast with quaint decor and artisanal cheese. This was where tired travelers met suspicious stew, where ale flowed freely, and so did lice, and where half your night was spent wondering whether the groan from the next bed was someone snoring or quietly dying. It was the messy, beating heart of the medieval world. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Before we check into our rather rustic accommodations for the evening, if you enjoy these trips into the grittier side of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And I'd love to know, what's the worst travel accommodation you've ever stayed in? A terrible hotel? A leaky tent? Let me know in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, pull your cloak a little tighter, and let's push open the heavy wooden door. It's not so much that the innkeeper wakes up. It's that he is awakened. The gentle sound is that of someone sneezing directly onto the floorboards of the common room below, followed by a dull groan, a crash, and the unmistakable clatter of a chicken escaping through the front door. Again, he opens one eye. It's still dark outside, that deep, inky black. That means it's either far too early or far too late. There is no in-between in medieval timekeeping. He sits up slowly, peeling himself off of the mattress with the stiffness of a man whose bones have settled into a permanent state of complaint. He rubs the sleep from his face with a sleeve that once resembled linen, but now has the texture of a worn saddlebag. His bed isn't bad. By the standards of the age, it's a straw-stuffed mattress, slightly slanted from years of use, with a single woolen blanket that smells faintly of garlic, wood smoke, and last Tuesday's spilled ale. It's cozy, in the way a slightly damp cloak is cozy if you don't ask too many questions. He dresses in stages, a ritual of numb familiarity. First, the tunic, then the trousers, then the belt, if he can find it. After a brief, fumbling search in the dark, he locates it hanging on a peg behind the door, along with a wooden spoon, a candle nub, and a single, lonely sock. He doesn't ask whose. Asking questions before the sun is fully up is a rookie mistake. Downstairs, the common room is quiet, unnervingly so. The air is thick with the ghosts of last night's revelry. The smell of stale ale, cold hearth smoke, and sleeping people. There are signs of life, or at least its messy aftermath. A tipped-over mug lies in a puddle of its own making. A single boot rests near the hearth, as if it decided to stay for one more story. And, of course, a man is snoring soundly under a table, his face buried in his arms, with the quiet confidence of someone who has done this many times before. The innkeeper steps carefully around him. Waking guests before they are ready often leads to awkward discussions at sword point. He stokes the hearth with a practiced flick of the poker, coaxing the embers back to life. The goal is warmth, not a roaring blaze. Firewood is expensive, and the last time he got a real fire going, a traveling mercenary tried to cook a goose on it indoors, with the feathers still on, as he sets a heavy iron pot over the flames, ready to reheat whatever last night's stew has evolved into overnight. He hears the distant bray of a mule and the clump of early travelers arriving on the road. He exhales a long, weary sigh that is part resignation, part gratitude. The inn isn't glamorous, it's not peaceful, but it's warm, it's busy, and most importantly, it's his. And just like that, the day begins. Again, breakfast at the inn is less of a meal and more of a negotiation between what's currently edible and what's legally defensible. The innkeeper ladles a thick scoop of something from a large cauldron into a smaller pot over the hearth. The substance doesn't have a name, but it does have a distinct smell, somewhere between boiled oats and a wet boot that's been thinking about cabbage. This is pottage, the medieval staple that fueled empires, or at least fueled the people who built them. It's not a recipe so much as a living concept, a perpetual stew. Yesterday's pottage was made with barley and turnips. Today's pottage includes those same turnips, now significantly softer, and some mysterious bits from a goose that failed to escape its fate last night. You add water, you heat, you stir, you repeat until the pot is empty or the guests stop asking. It's like soup. If soup had given up on its dreams halfway through, the bread is present. It's as hard as a roof tile and just as chewable. It's cut with care from a large, dark loaf, mostly because the innkeeper doesn't want to break another knife on it. Guests receive a thick slice and chew it slowly, partly for digestion and partly because it gives them time to reflect on their life choices between bites and to wash it all down. The ale. Oh yes, breakfast beer. This is not a medieval cliché. It's a public health necessity. The local water is questionable on a good day. Milk is a luxury usually reserved for the Lord's barn cat, and tea is still just a twinkle in some far-off merchant's eye. The ale is weak, watery, and lukewarm, but at least it's been boiled during the brewing process and filtered through sheer desperation. Even the children drink it, with supervision. Of course, this is a reputable establishment. After all, by now, guests are drifting into the common room one by one, drawn by the smell of smoke and the promise of something hot. A merchant enters, clutching his coin purse like a holy relic. A sleepy pilgrim follows, still leaning on his walking stick and muttering about blisters. And, inevitably, the bard arrives, requesting honey for his porridge, as though honey hasn't been locked in a chest in the cellar for weeks to protect it from thieves. And, well, bards. The barmaid, agile and immune to nonsense, moves between the tables like a dancer who has had quite enough. She smiles at the patrons, refills their wooden mugs, and dodges unsolicited compliments with the grace of someone who has memorized every possible bad poem a drunk traveler can recite. By the end of breakfast, the inn smells like smoke, barley, and wary ambition. Empty bowls clatter onto tables. Stomachs are fullish. Spirits are lukewarm. It's not fine dining, but it's hot, it's filling, and nobody has died yet, which, by medieval standards, is a triumph. If there's one thing a medieval inn doesn't need more of, it's people. Yet, by mid-morning, they begin to pour in, like pigeons with luggage, and about the same regard for personal hygiene. First through the door is a knight, or rather, someone claiming to be a knight. He has armor, yes, but it's a mismatched collection of rusty plates, held together with what looks like curtain rope. He strides in, demands a private room, the finest ale, and a stable for his horse, despite having no coin, no manners, and the general scent of a horse that lost a bet. Behind him trails a merchant's apprentice, who talks as if he owns a fleet of ships, but attempts to pay for his meal with buttons. He tries to haggle over the price of a bowl of soup, as though this establishment offers Groupon deals. Then comes the bard. Every inn has one. He never actually pays in coin, but insists that his songs are worth more than gold. They aren't. He carries a lute with 6 missing strings and immediately launches into a mournful tune about lost love and a case of suspected goat theft. Nobody asked for this. A monk shuffles in next, nodding solemnly at everyone and quietly blessing the furniture. He insists on fasting, loudly, while eyeing the bread on the counter. Within 10 minutes, he is eating said bread and explaining to anyone who will listen that technically, it's not a sin if the loaf was already broken. By noon, the inn's common room is a chaotic tapestry of clashing personalities and overlapping smells. Someone is drying their wet socks near the hearth. Someone else is sharpening a knife on a table corner for no clear reason. A child runs shrieking between tables, pursued by a goose with a long-held grudge. In the corner, 2 travelers are arguing over who gets the only stool that doesn't wobble. And overseeing it all is the innkeeper, as calm as a monk on payday. He has seen it all before. He knows that by evening, someone will have fallen in love, someone will have fallen asleep in their soup, and someone will have challenged a stool to a duel. Probably the bard again. He pours another mug of ale, wipes the counter with a cloth that has seen better centuries, and gives a knowing nod to the barmaid. It's a silent agreement that, despite everything, this place is still running. The guests may be unpredictable, loud, and occasionally bleeding, but they're also what makes the inn an inn, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Except maybe quieter, and with significantly fewer goose chases. If the inn has a soul, or at least a functioning central nervous system, it's the barmaid. Her name is Marjorie. She's about 20, possibly 30, or maybe she just aged rapidly from prolonged exposure to traveling poets. No one knows for sure. What people do know is that the entire operation would collapse into a stew-soaked heap of chaos without her. She moves through this crowded common room with a practiced, almost supernatural precision. One hand balances a heavy wooden tray of mugs. The other deftly swats away a wandering hand that has misjudged her patience. Her reflexes are faster than a ferret in a pantry. A drunken mercenary once tried to compliment her ankles and reportedly woke up 2 days later with his boots nailed to the ceiling. Marjorie can take an order in 4 different dialects, pour ale from a heavy cask without spilling a single drop, and insult a minor noble without technically committing treason. She's not rude, she's efficient, and in a building held together by splinters and half-promises, she is the only one with actual authority. She knows which travelers will pay in coin, and which will try to barter with seashells or a very valuable story. She can sniff out a fake accent, a stolen ring, and a flirtation disguised as a food complaint from 20 paces. The local priest may mumble about sin, but even he knows that Marjorie is the true patron saint of keeping things moving. Her day starts before dawn and ends long after the fire has burned low to embers. In that time, she'll serve hundreds of bowls of stew, chase out wandering livestock, bandage a scraped knee for a crying child, and somehow find time to refill every mug in the room, often while dodging falling cutlery or calming down a heated argument about who owns the goat that has wandered in again during lunch. And yet, she never drops the tray. That's the magic of it. Marjorie doesn't run the inn on paper, but in practice, it's her kingdom. The innkeeper might own the walls, but she controls the floor. A wink here, a sharp word there, a stare that can curdle milk at a distance. It's a delicate, exhausting dance, and she performs it daily, with the kind of weary grace that only comes from years of low expectations and an exceptionally high tolerance for nonsense. If you're enjoying this realistic look into the past, please consider hitting the like button. It lets me know you appreciate this kind of content and helps more people find our channel. Lunch at a medieval inn isn't so much a meal as it is a test of coordination, patience, and one's tolerance for noise that registers somewhere between a festival and a siege. It begins innocently enough. The hearth is warm, the stew is bubbling, and Marjorie rings the battered iron triangle that signals food is ready. A peaceful moment, brief, and immediately followed by stampede-level chaos. Guests emerge from corners you didn't know existed. A trader leaps over a sleeping dog. A bard swings his lute over one shoulder like he's marching into battle. 2 farmers argue over who sat down first, despite there being 6 empty benches and absolutely no one keeping score. The innkeeper ladles out steaming bowls of pottage, a dish whose exact ingredients are known only to the pot and possibly divine beings. It's hearty, warm, and completely flavorless, unless you count turnip as a flavor. One guest asks if it's vegetarian. Another asks what vegetarian means. The innkeeper pretends he doesn't hear either of them. Bread is handed out with the ceremonial thud of something recently used as a doorstop. Diners attempt to dip it in their stew to soften it, resulting in several casualties to the bottoms of bowls. One man tries to trade his crust for a second helping of ale. It works. Marjorie weaves through the chaos, her tray loaded with mugs, and her eyes locked in that 1,000-yard stare known only to battlefield nurses and women who've had to break up 2 arguments about seating etiquette before noon. She doles out food, smiles, and issues warnings all at once. A one-woman performance that deserves a round of applause, but will settle for a well-tipped jar. Somewhere near the hearth, a pair of guards is trying to out-burp each other, while a suspiciously cheerful monk hums a hymn between mouthfuls. The goat has returned. Again, it seems to enjoy the company. Lunch lasts about an hour, at least according to the sun. Time inside the inn is measured by how long it takes for someone to spill ale on themselves, accuse someone else of cheating at dice, or attempt to sing with a mouthful of onion. And when it's over, there's silence. Brief, eerie, until someone drops a spoon and it all begins again. Just as the last bowl is stacked and Marjorie dares to take a sip of leftover ale in peace, it happens. The door creaks open. New guests, fresh faces, fresh problems, and worst of all, fresh questions. The first traveler walks up to the bar and asks, "Do you serve almond milk?" The silence is immediate and total. Behind him arrives a young couple who ask if they can see the room first. Marjorie simply points upstairs. It's wooden. It has walls. It doesn't leak in the summer. Usually, the third guest, covered in dust and self-importance, insists on knowing where the inn sources its candles, whether the stew is ethically prepared, and if the goat has been trained to stay outside. The goat, of course, enters at that exact moment and promptly sneezes on his boots. Supper time arrives not with elegance, but with noise, loud, overlapping noise. This stew tastes different than last night. One traveler says with suspicion, "It's the same stew." Marjorie replies without looking up, "Oh, well, it's nice," they add quickly, now fearing for their cutlery privileges. The bard, who is still here somehow, offers to perform a song in honor of the meal. He gets through one verse before Marjorie places a ladle in his bowl, with a little more enthusiasm than necessary. He gets the message. The stew is filling, the ale flows freely, and despite the occasional complaint about texture, temperature, or the existential ambiguity of the meat, everyone eats. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, polishing a mug that hasn't been truly clean since last harvest, watching his patrons with the expression of a man who has accepted his fate. But for now, the room is loud, messy, and very much alive, which is, if nothing else, a sign of success. As the last spoon clinks against the bottom of a bowl, and guests begin to lean back with the groans of people who survived another round of stew, the real show begins. Evening entertainment, loosely defined. There is no scheduled program, no host with a lute. The evening simply unfolds the way all great performances do, with no structure, limited talent, and a strong chance of mild injury. The bard, of course, seizes the moment. He clears his throat dramatically, plucks 3 uncertain strings, and announces a ballad titled "The Fair Lady of Festerwell, Who Married a Troll." Half the room cheers, the other half groans. The innkeeper pours himself a mug of ale and drinks deeply. Meanwhile, at the far table, 2 old friends are trying to best each other in a slurred riddle contest. The dice come out next, wooden, chipped, and possibly cursed. A small crowd gathers as bets are made using coins, buttons, and one man's left shoe. Marjorie circles the room like a falcon with excellent hearing, watching for trouble, spilled ale, and anyone who looks like they're about to stand on a table. In the corner, a shy traveler shyly produces a flute. It produces 3 lovely notes before the goat headbutts him. Applause all around. Evening entertainment at the inn isn't polished or rehearsed, but it's real. It's loud, and it almost always ends with someone snoring into their mug. There is no official closing time at the inn. It's more of a gradual societal collapse. It begins when the bard finally loses his audience. Next, a few patrons start to slump, not from ale, necessarily, but from sheer caloric weight. The stew has settled. Gravity has won. Marjorie starts stacking empty mugs like she's building a small fortress. She doesn't say much, just raises one eyebrow, which in the language of innkeeping means wrap it up or start sweeping. Eventually, the room empties, not all at once, but in soft, wobbly waves. The chatter fades. The laughter dies down. The inn grows quiet. Sort of. A mug rolls off a table. Someone upstairs drops a boot. The goat sighs deeply. But for now, the worst of the day is over. Climbing the stairs in a medieval inn is an act of faith. Not spiritual faith, structural. The steps creak, groan, and occasionally shift underfoot, like they're considering early retirement. The rooms are mostly shared, dormitory-style arrangements, where strangers sleep mere inches apart, and everyone pretends not to hear anything. The beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw, and probably mice. Blankets, if you're lucky. Pillows, only if you brought your own or creatively folded your cloak. Snoring is inevitable. Not light, adorable snoring. We're talking medieval snoring, the kind that echoes off wooden beams and makes you question if there's a wild boar in the rafters. One guest tosses in his sleep, another talks, mostly about carrots. Privacy, as a concept, does not exist. And yes, the chamber pot, it's there. It's full, it's everyone's problem. And yet, despite the noises, the smells, and the suspicious straw, there's something oddly comforting about it. A dozen people, all from different places, sleeping under the same crooked beams, snoring in harmony. Upstairs isn't peaceful, but it's safe, warmish, and, with luck, mostly free of goats, which, at this hour of night, counts as luxury. At the first hint of light, that faint, murky gray that could be dawn or just an optimistic moon, the inn begins to stir, not gracefully, more like a barn full of animals that have realized someone forgot to lock the door. Feet hit the floor with varying degrees of commitment. Someone groans dramatically, as if waking up was unexpected and entirely unfair. Downstairs, the innkeeper is already awake. Technically, his eyes are open, his body is upright, but his soul is still somewhere with clean mugs and quiet guests. Marjorie arrives moments later, wrapped in a shawl and sheer determination. She begins her silent inventory of overnight damage: 2 overturned stools, 1 missing candle, and someone, inexplicably, put jam on the broom handle. The denials start immediately. I didn't spill that ale. I wasn't the one snoring. Everyone denies everything. Loudly, the bard reappears, bleary-eyed, and declares he has written a new verse about the night's events. He is promptly offered a bowl of porridge and told to eat quietly. By the time the sun fully rises, most guests have either paid or bartered their way out. The common room is quiet again, not peaceful, just taking a breath. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, cradling a mug of the morning's first ale like it's a family heirloom. He gazes across the room and mutters the same thing he mutters every morning. Well, that wasn't too bad. It was, of course. But optimism helps digestion. And just like that, the world is awake again, and with the world come new guests. The inn's door opens. The cycle begins again. The inn doesn't change much. The stew stays mysterious. The guests remain unpredictable. And yet, despite the noise, the mess, and the deeply suspicious smells, they always come. Maybe it's the warmth, the company, the chaos, or maybe it's the only place in town where your mistakes get swept up with the crumbs, and nobody asks questions before breakfast. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic was about the size of a pancake, and just as flat, a modest patch of reclaimed swamp, clinging to the edge of Europe. It was a nation seemingly designed by committee, with no grand mountains, no vast resources, and a constant, nagging suspicion that the sea might one day ask for its land back. And yet, for one brief, dazzling century, this tiny, damp republic would punch far above its weight, becoming the richest, most innovative, and most artistically brilliant nation on earth. While the rest of Europe was busy with monarchical drama and religious wars, the Dutch were quietly inventing modern capitalism, pioneering global trade, and commissioning portraits of themselves looking sternly at cheese. This is the story of the Dutch Golden Age, a time when a nation of merchants, painters, and engineers built an empire of light, money, and oil paint. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we journey to the bustling canals and velvet-lit rooms of the 17th century Netherlands. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that explore the complex intersection of art, commerce, and culture, please consider hitting that subscribe button. And I have a question for you. What do you think is more powerful in shaping a nation? Its military might or its economic power? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's travel back to a time when the most valuable thing in the world wasn't gold, but a shipload of nutmeg. The Dutch Golden Age was born from an act of rebellion after nearly 80 years of Spanish rule, a period of religious persecution and heavy taxation. The fiercely independent provinces of the Netherlands finally had enough. In 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia, they officially declared their independence. What followed was less a carefully planned national strategy and more of an entrepreneurial free-for-all. Imagine Silicon Valley, but everyone wears wooden shoes and invests in herring futures. If the Dutch Golden Age had a beating heart, it wasn't in a palace or a parliament. It was in the chaotic, bustling docks of cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam. While France polished its wigs, and Spain was still counting its gold from the New World, the Dutch were busy building the most formidable merchant fleet the world had ever seen. At its peak, the Dutch Republic had more ships than England, France, Spain, and Portugal combined. But these weren't just fishing boats with an attitude. These were vloeids, revolutionary cargo ships designed for maximum space and minimum crew, making them incredibly cost-effective. They were the floating warehouses of a global enterprise, carrying everything from timber from the Baltics to silk from China, spices from Indonesia, and sugar from Brazil. The engine of this global trade was a groundbreaking invention, the world's first multinational corporation, the Dutch East India Company, known by its formidable acronym, the VOC. Founded in 1602, the VOC was capitalism before it was cool, or even particularly ethical. It was the first company to issue stock, allowing ordinary citizens to invest in its voyages and share in the profits. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange became the financial center of the world, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the promise of a single shipload of cloves or cinnamon. The VOC did whatever it took to protect its profits. It had its own private army, built fortresses across Asia, and engaged in ruthless colonial tactics to secure its monopoly on the spice trade. The Spice Islands, in what is now Indonesia, became a theater of brutal conquest. While the VOC was ruling the East, the West India Company handled business in the Atlantic, which included the trade of sugar, rum, and, most darkly, enslaved people. The Dutch involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was not incidental. It was a systemic and profitable part of their economic empire. The same nation commissioning serene paintings of milkmaids was also meticulously cataloging human lives on a ledger. The Golden Age had a deeply tarnished underside, yet amid this brutal efficiency, the Dutch also brought a kind of order to global trade. Their ships sailed on set routes, their cargoes were insured, and their ports were clean, secure, and shockingly well managed. They weren't just navigating oceans, they were navigating economics. While other countries sent explorers and conquistadors, the Dutch sent accountants with muskets. Their empire wasn't just built with swords, it was built with balance sheets. While Dutch ships were hauling goods across continents, something else was happening back home. Quietly, almost silently, in the towns and homes of the Dutch Republic, a girl poured milk from a ceramic jug. A woman laced her pearls in a sun-drenched room. A letter was read in silence beside an open window. And with every one of these mundane moments, a man named Johannes Vermeer was turning ordinary life into eternal poetry. Vermeer was not the most famous painter of his day. In fact, he was a relatively minor figure, producing a grand total of about 35 known works in his entire lifetime. That's less than what Rembrandt might have sketched in a single productive week. But what Vermeer lacked in volume, he made up for in sheer radiance. His paintings are calm, composed, and eerily luminous, as if someone figured out how to paint sunlight holding its breath. What set him apart? A near mystical understanding of light and a painstaking precision. The interiors he painted weren't just backgrounds. They were characters in their own right. You can almost hear the creak of the wooden floors, feel the cool air from an open window, and sense the quiet passage of time. And that is the secret of Dutch Golden Age art. While the outside world raced forward with trade and war, artists like Vermeer captured the sacredness of slowness, of intimacy, and of the private, inner world. Of course, Vermeer's magic wasn't performed in a vacuum. This was a society that adored images. The average Dutch home in the 17th century had more paintings on its walls than many aristocratic palaces elsewhere in Europe. They bought landscapes, portraits, still lifes, seascapes, and a generous number of paintings featuring dead fish arranged artfully on tables. They loved it all. Why? Because this was the world's first great middle-class society. The merchants, bakers, brewers, and butchers had money, and they had taste. They didn't want grand paintings of floating cherubs or bloody battles. They wanted art that looked like their world, but slightly better lit, and the painters delivered. Dutch art became an industry fast, detailed, and refreshingly local. But back to Vermeer. His works weren't flashy or political. They didn't shout. They whispered. And in those whispers were volumes about solitude, reflection, and the quiet drama of domestic life. He painted what was often overlooked and made it unforgettable. But outside his peaceful, sunlit rooms, a different kind of Dutch obsession was brewing, one that would dazzle the world and then spectacularly implode. If you are enjoying this exploration of art and history, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps our channel reach more people who appreciate these stories. Picture this. You walk into a tavern in Amsterdam in the year 1636. A man next to you offers to sell you a single tulip bulb, not a bouquet, not a field, just one bulb. The price, the same as a grand house on one of the city's finest canals. And the truly crazy part, you seriously consider it. Welcome to tulip mania, the fever dream of early capitalism, and possibly the world's first recorded speculative bubble. The Dutch didn't invent tulips, which were imported from the Ottoman Empire, but they perfected the art of monetizing them. Tulips, especially the rare, striped, broken varieties, which were actually the result of a virus that made them more beautiful and unpredictable, became the ultimate status symbols. Owning a unique bulb, like the legendary Semper Augustus, was like owning a supercar today, except you had to dig it out of the dirt and hope no one accidentally made soup out of it. At first, it was just wealthy collectors, but soon everyone wanted in. Farmers, artisans, chimney sweeps. If you could hold a coin and had a pulse, you were speculating in tulips. Entire family savings were spent. Futures contracts were invented, allowing people to trade the rights to bulbs that hadn't even bloomed yet. It wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about flipping a promise before the petal ever showed. For a brief, dazzling moment, tulips were the Bitcoin of the 17th century. Then came the crash. In February of 1637, the market suddenly seized up. People stopped buying. Maybe they blinked and realized they were mortgaging their homes for plants. Maybe someone actually saw a prized tulip bloom and thought, wait, that's it. Prices collapsed. Fortunes vanished overnight. Suddenly, that one bulb you paid the price of a house for was just a bulb. You might as well plant it and try to enjoy the view. Strangely enough, the Dutch economy didn't fully collapse with the tulip market. It was deeply embarrassing. Yes, there were lawsuits and public sermons about greed and vanity, but the Republic shrugged, dusted off its doublets, and moved on. While tulips were being traded like jewels, something else was quietly blossoming in the Dutch Republic. The mind. They didn't just ship goods, they shipped ideas. And in the 17th century, that was a dangerous business, at a time when publishing the wrong opinion in Spain or France could get you burned at the stake. The Netherlands became a haven for writers, philosophers, and rebels with quills. The Dutch had a relatively tolerant attitude toward free thought, at least as long as it didn't interfere with trade. This meant that books banned elsewhere flowed out of Amsterdam's printing presses. The French philosopher René Descartes wrote and published some of his most influential works here. Baruch Spinoza, the excommunicated Jewish philosopher, who argued that God and nature were one and the same, lived and thought in relative peace. Universities like Leiden became intellectual magnets, drawing students from across Europe. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't just built on water. It was built on ideas. Imagine a city built like a painting, straight lines, soft curves, and everything in its proper place, even the ducks. That was Amsterdam in the 17th century, a masterpiece of urban design brought to life by engineers, merchants, and a stubborn refusal to let water win. The Dutch didn't just build cities, they drained them into existence. At the heart of this watery miracle was the canal ring of Amsterdam. It was elegant, efficient, and about as close as urban planning gets to poetry. Concentric canals carved the city into districts. Goods moved by boat, not cart. Rich merchants built the now iconic narrow houses with steep steps and grand gabled facades. Those tall, slender houses weren't just an aesthetic choice. They were a tax strategy. Property taxes were based on the width of the house, not its height. So, people built upward, not outward, squeezing luxury into vertical elegance. The result was an architectural skyline that looked like gingerbread real estate and smelled faintly of Calvinist restraint, and it all served as a message. The Dutch Republic wasn't about kings or cathedrals. It was about cities, citizens, and civic pride. For all its brilliance, the Dutch Golden Age was not a utopia. Behind the tulips and oil paintings lay a republic built on tension, political, religious, and military. Politically, the Dutch Republic was a complex jigsaw puzzle of provinces, each jealously guarding its own rights. The real power lay with the wealthy merchant class. Religiously, the Calvinists were in charge, and other faiths were only tolerated as long as they kept quiet. And internationally, the Dutch were now a major power, and the old guard of Europe didn't like that. The English, once their Protestant allies, now saw them as economic rivals. This led to a series of Anglo-Dutch wars, brutal naval brawls where both sides lost ships and pride. Meanwhile, France under Louis XIV had grown aggressive, and the resulting wars were incredibly expensive. The Dutch could juggle commerce, culture, and colonies, but they couldn't juggle forever. The cracks in the Golden Age had begun to show. Golden Ages don't typically end with an explosion. More often, they fade, quietly, awkwardly, like a party where the best guests have already left. The Dutch Republic in the late 17th and early 18th centuries wasn't collapsing. It was simply sighing. Trade remained strong, but competitors were catching up. England and France were getting better at naval warfare, and even better at copying Dutch business models. Innovation slowed. Painters started repeating what sold. More cows, more ships, more sleepy windmills. Art became safe. Banking became cautious. The energy had shifted. The final blow came not as a single disaster, but as a shift in the global winds. The Age of Enlightenment was dawning elsewhere. Britain took the crown as the world's leading financial and naval superpower. France was setting the stage in art and science, and the Dutch, once the marvel of Europe, found themselves quietly edged out of the spotlight. But the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age never disappeared. It lives on in our modern world, in libraries, in galleries, and in the very foundations of our global economy. The Dutch streamlined capitalism with the world's first stock exchange and shareholder corporations. In art, Vermeer's quiet light and Rembrandt's stormy faces taught us that greatness could be found in the ordinary. In ideas, their relative tolerance allowed thinkers to publish works that pushed Europe toward the Enlightenment, and in their cities, they showed the world a model of urban life built not for kings, but for citizens. In the brief, brilliant glow of that one century, the Dutch showed the world a new model of success, one powered not by royalty, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What do you think is the most important legacy a nation can leave behind? Is it its art, its ideas, or its economic innovations? Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. Forget stadiums, sponsorship deals, and national anthems. The very first Olympic Games had none of that. There were no timers, no slow-motion replays, and certainly no celebrity endorsements. There was just dust, sweat, a sacred olive tree, and men competing in the nude for the glory of the gods. The year was 776 BCE, and the location was Olympia, a quiet religious sanctuary in southern Greece, dedicated to Zeus himself, the king of the gods, champion of lightning bolts, and, apparently, an enthusiast for athletic excellence. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we journey back to the origins of the world's greatest athletic spectacle, to a time when sport was not entertainment, but a form of prayer. Before we begin, if you enjoy exploring the deep roots of our modern traditions, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. What do you think is the ultimate purpose of sports? Is it entertainment, personal excellence, or something more? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's travel to a time when winning didn't earn you a medal, but a chance at immortality. To the ancient Greeks, the Olympic Games weren't just about flexing your glistening, olive oil-covered biceps in front of a crowd. They were, first and foremost, a sacred act of worship. The athletes were not simply competitors, they were pilgrims, and Olympia was not just an arena, it was one of the most important religious sanctuaries in the entire Greek world. Nestled in a lush, green grove called the Altis, Olympia was more temple than stadium. The entire site was a testament to the power of the gods, particularly Zeus. The most important structure was the magnificent Temple of Zeus, a colossal Doric masterpiece that once housed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a gigantic, 40-foot-tall statue of Zeus, sculpted by the master Phidias from ivory and gold. It was said that the statue was so awe-inspiring that to gaze upon it was to forget all your earthly troubles. This was the divine referee, looming over every contest. The rituals began days before the first race was ever run. The athletes, who had to arrive a month early for supervised training, would begin the festival with a solemn procession to the altar of Zeus. Horkeos, Zeus of the Oaths. There, standing before a fearsome statue of the god holding a thunderbolt in each hand, they would swear a sacred oath with their families and trainers present, promising not to cheat, bribe an opponent, or engage in any malice. Breaking this vow was not just poor sportsmanship, it was sacrilege, an offense against the king of the gods himself. Cheaters who were caught were heavily fined, and the money was used to build bronze statues of Zeus, called Zanes, which lined the entrance path to the stadium. Each statue was inscribed with the name of the cheater and his city, an eternal monument to their shame. And then there were the sacrifices, lots of them. The centerpiece of the festival was the hecatomb, the ritual sacrifice of 100 oxen at the great altar of Zeus. On the 3rd day of the games, a grand procession would lead the animals to the altar, where their throats were cut and their thigh bones burned as an offering to the gods. The smoke, the chanting, the smell of blood and burning meat, it was all part of a massive communal offering. The rest of the meat was cooked and shared among the thousands of spectators, turning the games into a sacred barbecue on a divine scale. Fire was also central to the ceremony, a sacred flame, believed to have been lit by the pure rays of the sun using a concave mirror, burned perpetually at the altar of the goddess Hestia. This ancient tradition directly inspired the modern Olympic flame and torch relay. For the Greeks, every aspect of the games was steeped in religious meaning. Winning meant Zeus himself had smiled upon you. Losing meant, well, maybe you should have sacrificed another ox. The first Olympic Games may have started with a single-foot race, but things escalated quickly. What began as one man sprinting roughly 600 feet turned into a sprawling, 5-day festival of events that tested every aspect of the male physique: speed, strength, skill, and how well you could fight someone half covered in olive oil. Let's begin with the basics. Running. After the first event, the stadion. A single sprint down the length of the track, more races were added to the program. The Diaulos was the ancient equivalent of the 400-meter dash, one length of the track there, and one back. Then came the Dolichos, a long-distance race that could last for up to 24 laps of the stadium, totaling nearly 5,000 meters. Imagine running that far in the blistering Greek summer sun, completely naked, no high-tech running shoes, no water breaks, just you, your feet, and probably some very uncomfortable dust. For those who wanted an even greater challenge, there was the Hoplitodromos, a race where competitors ran wearing a heavy bronze helmet, greaves, and carrying a shield. It was a test of not just speed, but of the strength and endurance required of a Greek soldier. A final, grueling tribute to the martial spirit of the games. But it wasn't all about speed. The Greeks adored combat sports, and their games reflected that raw passion. Wrestling, or pale, was a technical and highly respected affair. No biting or eye gouging was allowed, but pretty much everything else was fair game. An athlete had to throw his opponent to the ground 3 times to win. It was the cerebral cousin of the far more chaotic pankration. The pankration was an all-out, no-holds-barred combination of boxing and wrestling, where almost anything went. Punches, kicks, chokeholds, and joint locks. The rules were simple. Don't kill your opponent, at least not intentionally. It was violent, brutal, and one of the most popular events, boxing, called pygmachia, was just as savage. There were no padded gloves, just thin leather straps called himantes, wrapped around the knuckles, leaving the fingers free. These were designed not to soften the blow, but to protect the puncher's hands. Matches had no rounds and no time limits. They simply continued until one man surrendered by raising a single finger or was knocked unconscious. It was less float like a butterfly and more survive with your teeth intact. For the ultimate all-around athlete, there was the pentathlon. This was a 5-event spectacle consisting of the long jump, discus throw, javelin throw, the stadion race, and wrestling. The long jump was unique, performed with stone or lead weights called halteres held in each hand, which athletes would swing forward to supposedly increase their momentum. The discus and javelin were not just about distance, but also about style and form, reflecting their origins as skills of warfare. And finally, the most prestigious and dangerous event of all, the chariot races, held in a vast arena called the hippodrome. These races, with 2 or 4 horse teams, were a spectacle of wealth, speed, and spectacular crashes. The interesting twist: it was the owner of the horses who was declared the victor, not the driver who risked his life. This meant a wealthy aristocrat could hire a skilled charioteer, and if his team won, he would receive the olive wreath and the glory. It was the ultimate display of status. Each of these events pushed men to their absolute limits, but they weren't competing for gold or money. They were chasing something far more valuable in the ancient Greek world: seklios, eternal fame. If you were dreaming of participating in the ancient Olympic Games, I hope you were Greek, male, and very, very comfortable being nude. The games were sacred, prestigious, and about as exclusive as a Spartan wine club. The rules were strict, the requirements were intimidating, and the list of those allowed to compete was very short. First and foremost, athletes had to be free-born Greek men, not slaves, not foreigners whom the Greeks called barbarians, and certainly not women. The Olympics were a showcase of Greek masculinity in all its oiled-up glory. Competitors came from city-states all across the Greek-speaking world, from Athens and Sparta to colonies in Italy and modern-day Turkey, but they all had to prove their Hellenic bloodline. Citizenship was a birthright, and without it, you weren't setting foot on that track. And then there was the nudity. Competing nude was the standard for almost all events. Why? The reasons are debated, but it was likely a combination of factors. The Greeks believed the male body was an expression of divine perfection, and competing without clothes was a way to honor the gods and display that physical excellence. It was also practical in the intense heat, and it made it harder to cheat by grabbing an opponent's clothing in combat sports. Whatever the reason, it was a fundamental part of the game's identity. Training wasn't optional. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment. You didn't just show up at Olympia and hope for the best. Athletes had to prove they had been in continuous training for at least 10 months prior to the games. Then, they had to arrive in the nearby city of Ely 1 month before the festival began for a final, intense period of supervised training. This wasn't a casual pastime. It was a full-time job. Officials called the Hellanodikai, who served as both judges and organizers, would observe the athletes during this month and had the power to disqualify anyone who wasn't up to standard. There was no room for slackers. Now, about women. They were, with very few exceptions, banned from competing, and married women were forbidden from even attending the games as spectators, under penalty of death. Unmarried women, however, were permitted to watch. The one major exception was the priestess of Demeter, who was given a seat of honor opposite the judges. But that didn't mean women were entirely excluded from sport. They had their own separate festival at Olympia, the Heraean Games, held in honor of the goddess Hera. These games consisted of foot races for young women and girls of various ages who, unlike their male counterparts, competed fully clothed. In the end, the games were as much a mirror of Greek society as they were a contest of athletic prowess. Proud, patriarchal, intensely competitive, and meticulously regulated to the casual observer, the games were a festival of sport and religion. But beneath the laurel wreaths and wrestling matches, something far more strategic was at play: politics. In ancient Greece, everything was political, including who could throw a discus the farthest. The games offered the perfect opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states, the polis, to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient equivalent of international public relations. Winning an event didn't just bring glory to the athlete. It brought immense prestige to his home city. A victory was a billboard for your hometown's superiority, proof that your citizens were stronger, faster, and more favored by the gods than your rivals. City-states funded and trained top athletes as a matter of civic pride. Victories were immortalized in commissioned poems by famous poets like Pindar, and statues of the victors were erected both at Olympia and back in their home cities. An Olympic victor was a celebrity, a war hero, and a propaganda tool all in one. But the Olympics weren't just for flexing muscles. They were for forging alliances. Political leaders and diplomats from across the Greek world used the games as a neutral meeting ground. Treaties were negotiated, alliances were announced, and political deals were struck in the shade of the olive trees. Even military campaigns were often timed around the Ekecheria, or Olympic truce. This was a formal agreement, announced by heralds traveling from city to city, that all Greek states would cease hostilities for a period before, during, and after the games, allowing athletes and spectators to travel to Olympia in safety. In theory, it was a beautiful moment of pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was more of a polite suggestion. Some wars did pause, but the truce was occasionally violated, leading to fines and even bans from the games. Sparta, naturally, was famously banned on at least one occasion for its typically warlike behavior. The sanctuary itself became a kind of ancient leaderboard. Wealthy city-states that had won battles or amassed fortunes would build ornate treasuries at Olympia to house their offerings and flaunt their success. The entire site was a political and artistic arms race in marble and bronze. Even cheating had political consequences. If an athlete was caught bribing an opponent, the shame fell not only on him, but on his entire city, a black mark on its reputation in the fiercely competitive world of Greek rivalry. If this journey back to the heart of ancient competition is fascinating you, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps these stories of our shared human history reach a wider audience. The games are over. The dust has settled. The crowds are heading home, but for a select few, those crowned with a simple wreath of olive leaves, life is never going to be the same again. In ancient Greece, an Olympic victory wasn't just an athletic achievement, it was a full-blown life upgrade. Winning at Olympia meant you had received the direct favor of Zeus himself, and that kind of divine endorsement came with serious earthly perks. Victors returned to their home cities as heroes. They were greeted by cheering crowds and parades. Statues were raised in their honor in the city square. Poets were hired to compose long, dramatic, and extremely flattering odes celebrating their strength and virtue. Some cities tore down a section of their defensive walls to welcome a victor home, a symbolic gesture suggesting that a city with such a hero no longer needed walls for protection, and the rewards were tangible. Many victors were granted free meals for life at the public expense, a far better prize than a gold medal, especially in a world where your next dinner wasn't always guaranteed. They were given front-row seats at festivals and theaters. Wealthy patrons would line up to be their sponsors. Their families would arrange better marriage prospects. They were no longer just men. They were legends. But with fame came immense expectation. Olympic victors weren't allowed to fade into obscurity. They became symbols, living proof of their city's greatness. Some were appointed as generals or sent on important diplomatic missions. Their bodies had earned them glory, and now their names had to carry that glory for the rest of their lives. For the Greeks, the ultimate prize was kleos, immortal fame. It was the chance to be remembered, not just by your children or your city, but by history itself. And that's what made the Olympic Games more than sport. They were a forge for legacy. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games blazed like a sacred flame, held every 4 years with remarkable consistency, even through wars, political upheaval, and plagues. But even the most sacred traditions are not immune to time. By the 4th century CE, the world had changed. The Roman Empire had conquered the Greek world. The games continued, but their religious meaning began to fade. The Romans enjoyed the spectacle, but the idea of sport as divine devotion didn't resonate as deeply in a culture that preferred gladiatorial combat to nude wrestling. Then came the final blow. In 393 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, a fervent Christian, issued an edict that banned all pagan festivals and cults throughout the empire. This included the Olympic Games. After more than a millennium of continuous tradition, the sacred flame at Olympia was extinguished. The temples were eventually destroyed or fell into ruin. Earthquakes and floods buried the site under layers of silt and sand. The sanctuary fell silent. For centuries, the games lived on only in legends and ancient texts, until the late 19th century, when that old flame flickered back to life, inspired by the ideals of ancient Greece. A French aristocrat named Baron Pierre de Coubertin spearheaded a movement to revive the Olympic Games as a modern, international competition. And so, in 1896, the first modern Olympics were held in Athens, Greece, fittingly, in the very land where they began. Today's games are bigger, louder, and significantly more clothed, but echoes of the original still remain. The 4-year cycle, the sacred torch lit at Olympia, and the pursuit of excellence. And it all began with a cook named Koroibos, a single foot race, and a wreath of olive leaves beneath the watchful gaze of Zeus. What do you think is the most important ideal from the ancient games that we should carry into our modern world? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. The year was 1791, and the United States was less a country and more a very expensive, very fragile experiment. The revolution had been won. The ink on the new Constitution was barely dry, but the war had left behind a mountainous debt. The fledgling federal government was broke, and the most urgent question on everyone's mind in the temporary capital of Philadelphia was, who is going to pay for all this? Enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, a man who didn't just love strong financial systems. He worshipped them as the bedrock of national power. Hamilton's plan was audacious: consolidate the state's debts under the federal government, establish a national bank, and, here's the kicker, raise revenue through federal taxes. And not just any tax, but an excise tax on a product he knew the country produced and consumed in vast quantities: distilled spirits, better known as the whiskey tax. To Hamilton and the Eastern elites, it made perfect sense. Whiskey was a luxury for some, a staple for others, and taxing it seemed like a fair and reliable way to fill the government's empty coffers. But out on the western frontier, in the rugged, isolated hills of Pennsylvania and Kentucky, farmers had a very different idea. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we explore the first great challenge to the authority of the United States Constitution. A story of taxes, liberty, and a stubborn refusal to be governed from afar. Before we dive in, if you enjoy stories that uncover the deep conflicts that shaped nations, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. What do you think is the fairest way to tax a population? Is it based on income, property, or the goods people consume? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's travel back to a time when a tax on whiskey was enough to bring a new nation to the brink of civil war. To understand why Western farmers exploded with rage over a whiskey tax, you have to understand the frontier mindset of the 1790s. Life west of the Allegheny Mountains wasn't just hard. It was a different world. Roads were often little more than muddy, impassable trails. News from the capital in Philadelphia could take weeks to arrive, and the federal government felt like a distant, foreign power. For these frontier farmers, whiskey wasn't a luxury item enjoyed in a city tavern. It was the very lifeblood of their economy. Transporting bulky crops like corn and rye over the mountains to eastern markets was nearly impossible. So, farmers did what they had done for generations. They distilled their excess grain into whiskey. A horse could carry only a few bushels of grain, but it could carry the equivalent of 24 bushels if that grain was converted into liquid. Whiskey was durable, it didn't spoil, and most importantly, it was a stable and widely accepted form of currency. In a region where hard money was scarce, a gallon of Monongahela rye could be used to pay wages, trade for nails, or buy a pig. The whiskey still in the barn wasn't just a piece of farm equipment. It was a bank. Hamilton's tax, passed in 1791, felt like a direct assault on this way of life. Worse still, the structure of the tax seemed deliberately designed to punish small producers. Large distillers in the East could pay a flat annual fee, which was more manageable and less intrusive. But small, backwoods farmers were taxed by the gallon. This required government inspectors, complex paperwork, and cash payments they simply didn't have. To them, it felt like a punitive measure designed by Eastern elites to crush their small operations and favor large, wealthy producers. To these men, many of whom had fought in the Revolution against what they saw as tyrannical British taxes, this felt like a profound betrayal. The war had been fought over the principle of no taxation, without representation. And now, a distant federal government was reaching deep into their pockets and their barns. They saw it as an attack on their liberty, their property, and their very survival. The seeds of rebellion were planted, not in the halls of Congress, but in log cabins and backwoods taverns, where the talk turned from frustration to open defiance, and it was all over whiskey. At first, the resistance was a campaign of classic civil disobedience. Tax collectors were ignored, forms were left unfiled. But as the government pressed the issue, the resistance grew more organized and more violent. Federal officials trying to enforce the tax found themselves on the wrong end of angry mobs. In western Pennsylvania, the heart of the resistance, federal tax inspector John Neville became a symbol of everything the farmers hated. He was a wealthy landowner and a prominent figure, one of the few men brave or stubborn enough to actually try and collect the tax. Collectors working under him were harassed, threatened, and attacked. One was stripped, whipped, tarred, and feathered, and left tied to a tree in the woods, a frontier fashion statement with a very clear message: go home. When the federal courts in Philadelphia issued subpoenas for distillers who had failed to pay, the situation escalated. Marshal David Lennox, tasked with serving these rights, became a target. For the farmers, being summoned to a federal court hundreds of miles away in Philadelphia was an impossible burden, equivalent to financial ruin. It felt like another deliberate tactic to punish them. By 1794, this was no longer a protest. It was an open insurrection. The flashpoint came in July of that year, when Marshal Lennox, accompanied by John Neville, attempted to serve a writ at the farm of William Miller. An armed group of farmers intercepted them. A shot was fired. It's unclear by whom, and the officials were forced to retreat. The next day, the rebellion exploded. A mob of several hundred armed men, some of them decorated Revolutionary War veterans, surrounded Neville's fortified home, Bower Hill. They demanded he resign his post and hand over his tax records. Neville refused, and a gun battle erupted. The rebels, now numbering close to 600, set fire to Neville's home and outbuildings. A rebel leader was killed, and Neville's defenders, a small group of soldiers from nearby Fort Pitt, were forced to surrender. Bower Hill was burned to the ground. The message was unmistakable. The frontier was not bluffing. This was no longer about a tax. It was about who held power. In the days that followed, the resistance coalesced into a full-blown mobilization. A rebel militia of nearly 7,000 men gathered outside Pittsburgh, calling themselves the Defenders of Liberty, and proudly flying a flag with 6 stripes, representing the rebellious counties. They talked of secession, of forming a new country west of the mountains. To many in the federal government, it was beginning to look like Shays' Rebellion all over again, but with more guns, better organization, and a lot more whiskey. This was the first great test of the new American Constitution. The question was no longer whether the government had the right to tax, but whether it had the power to govern at all. If you're finding this story about the fragile beginnings of a nation compelling, please take a moment to hit the like button. It supports our channel and helps us bring more of these crucial histories to light. By the fall of 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had escalated from a regional disturbance to a direct challenge to the authority of the United States. In Philadelphia, President George Washington watched with growing alarm as his carefully stitched republic began to unravel at the seams. This was no ordinary law and order situation. It was a constitutional crisis. Washington understood precisely what was at stake. If the rebellion succeeded, or if the federal government failed to respond decisively, it would set a disastrous precedent. It would signal to the entire nation and to the world that the laws of the United States could be defied with impunity. The young republic could fracture before it even had a chance to stand on its own 2 feet. Urged on by his hawkish Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, Washington made a decision that stunned the nation. He would not just send a message, he would deliver it in person. He decided to lead the army himself. Washington thus became, and remains, the only sitting U.S. president to personally command troops in the field. For a man who had famously relinquished power after the Revolution, this was not an act of ego. It was an act of grim necessity. He wanted to demonstrate, in the most powerful way possible, that the Constitution was not just a piece of parchment. It had muscle. Washington mobilized a massive federalized militia of nearly 13,000 troops, an army larger than the one he had commanded at Yorktown. Militiamen from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia were called up. They assembled as they had in 1776, except this time, they weren't marching against the British. They were marching west to face their own countrymen. Washington rode out in his full military uniform, a solemn and imposing figure. His presence was intended to intimidate, and it worked. As word of the massive army marching westward spread through the frontier, the rebellion began to dissolve. The fiery rhetoric and brave talk of secession evaporated in the face of overwhelming federal force. Many of the rebels had assumed the government would send a few marshals or write some angry letters. They had not expected the President of the United States at the head of a formidable army. By the time the federal troops reached western Pennsylvania, most of the rebellion had melted away into the hills. Its leaders had either fled or gone into hiding. Local support for the cause vanished. The show of force had succeeded without a single major battle. Once he was certain the region was secured, Washington handed command over to General Light Horse Harry Lee and returned to Philadelphia. His point had been made with crystal clarity. The federal government had the right to pass laws, and it had the power to enforce them. When Washington's army arrived in western Pennsylvania, they didn't find a battlefield. They found silence. The rebel militias had vanished, and towns that once brimmed with fiery anti-tax sentiment now greeted federal troops with suspiciously polite smiles. The rebellion had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. But justice, or at least the appearance of it, still had to be served. Federal troops began rounding up suspected rebels, ultimately arresting over 150 men. Many of them were more confused than combative, swept up for simply being in the wrong tavern at the wrong time. The government wanted to show it meant business, but it also needed to avoid looking like a tyrant crushing poor farmers. It was a delicate balance. The arrested men were marched back east for trial in a grim procession that was meant to be a public display of federal authority. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason, a capital offense, and then, in a final, masterful act of political wisdom, Washington pardoned both of them. Why? Because Washington understood that sometimes unity is more important than punishment. He had already made his point. The law had been defended. The Constitution had held firm. Executing a couple of whiskey rebels would have gained nothing. It might have turned them into martyrs, inflamed public opinion, and reignited the flames of resistance. Instead, Washington extended mercy. It was a calculated move, but also characteristic of his leadership style. Firm in principle, but restrained in action. His goal was not vengeance. It was precedent, and that precedent was now crystal clear. The federal government had the authority to govern all its citizens, and it would use force if necessary. But it would also temper that power with prudence. For many on the frontier, however, the rebellion and its suppression confirmed their worst fears, that the federal government was a tool of Eastern elites who cared little for their lives and livelihoods. The resentment simmered, and it would soon find a powerful new voice in the political arena. The muskets were quiet, the rebels had dispersed, but politically, the real battle was just beginning. The Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority, it exposed the deep fractures in the new republic's identity. And at the center of this divide were 2 towering figures with wildly different visions for America's soul: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, the architect of the whiskey tax, saw the rebellion's suppression as a resounding victory for order and national survival. For him, The show of force was proof that a strong central government was essential. His ideal America was industrial, commercially powerful, and respected on the world stage. The rebellion was, in his eyes, a dangerous bout of lawlessness that had to be put down decisively. But Jefferson saw something entirely different. Jefferson, who had been serving as Secretary of State, was appalled, not by the rebellion itself, but by the government's military response to Jefferson and his growing base of agrarian supporters. Sending a 13-man army to confront angry farmers over a liquor tax looked terrifyingly like the actions of a European monarchy. This wasn't enforcement. It was intimidation. He feared Hamilton's vision would create a nation run by bankers and wealthy merchants, not by the independent, virtuous farmers he saw as the bedrock of the Republic. The Whiskey Rebellion became political ammunition. Jefferson and his ally, James Madison, began to organize formal opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies. Their movement, soon to be known as the Democratic-Republican Party, framed themselves as the protectors of liberty, the rights of states, and the common man against an overreaching federal government. The Federalists, in turn, painted Jefferson's camp as dangerous radicals and mob sympathizers who would plunge the nation into chaos. The rebellion, in other words, crystallized America's first political parties. Lines were drawn, newspapers took sides. The debate over the whiskey tax became shorthand for a much larger struggle between centralized power and local autonomy, between the Hamiltonian vision of a strong, unified nation and the Jeffersonian vision of a decentralized confederation of sovereign states. So while the rebellion was crushed militarily, it lived on politically, becoming a foundational story that both parties would retell to their advantage. For Federalists, it was a story of how the Constitution held firm against anarchy. For Democratic Republicans, it was a story of how a powerful government had overstepped its bounds and threatened the very liberties the Revolution had been fought to secure. After all the drama, the military march, and the political fallout, the whiskey tax itself had an unceremonious end. Despite the government's show of force, enforcement remained difficult and unpopular in the western counties. The tax never generated significant revenue and cost more to collect than it was worth. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, ushering in what he called the Revolution of 1800, one of his first acts was to appeal to his frontier supporters. In 1802, the whiskey tax was repealed by Congress. The controversial tax that had sparked a rebellion and helped define the nation's first political fault lines disappeared quietly. With the stroke of a pen, the law had held, yes, but the people had spoken, and in the end, their voices, channeled through the political process, had won. The legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion is a complex one. It was the first and only time a sitting U.S. president led troops in the field. It was the first major test of the Constitution's authority. But more than that, it established a pattern that would echo throughout American history. The ongoing, often contentious, debate between federal power and individual liberty. It wasn't just about whiskey. It was about who gets to make the rules, who has to follow them, and what happens when people believe those rules are unjust. History may have aged the whiskey, but the questions raised by the rebellion still burn. What do you think the Whiskey Rebellion teaches us about the balance between law and protest today? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the turbulent youth of the United States. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious,